Firelight licks the edges of an old manuscript, and in its wavering glow, a question breathes like smoke. What do you do when the monster wears your face? We build walls and light torches against the things that come from the dark vampires at the window, witches in the hedgerow, ghosts that rattle the eaves, but the terror that unmans us is closer, softer, whispering in our own voice. For thousands of years, across deserts and fjords, under temple roofs, and in forest chapels, we told each other versions of the same dread, that beneath the fragile lace of manners and prayer lies a second self, lean and hungry, watching through our eyes. The beast that comes from without can be fought or fled. The beast that comes from within must be starved, bargained with, confessed, or when all else fails, named. Somewhere in the hush between the last bell and first dawn, around cooking fires and monastery hearths, we gave that fear a shape, teeth, a spine bent to a runner's gait, a muzzle red to the whiskers. But the true shock was not the wolf at the door, it was the wolf in the cradle song, the beast that moves through us like a winter river under ice. We learned to say, beware the neighbor whose shadow lengthens at sundown, beware the friend whose appetite is too clean, whose gaze flinches from mirrored water. More secretly, we learned to fear our own sudden rages, our unprovoked hungers, the way the moon can make a man feel unstitched from himself. The older stories knew this. The monster that comes from the forest is an animal. The monster that rises from the heart is an omen. In every tongue, the myth found its masks. The Greeks told of kings judged by thunder and turned to wolves as punishment for sacrilege, proof that hospitality, bread, salt, shelter was law written deeper than stone. Far north, among skerries and snowfields, warriors dressed in hide and hunger called the wolf into their bones and went to war as if ridden by a god. In the valleys of Christendom, when the world tightened under one cross, the old shapeshifters were recut as heretics. The fur became a confession, the howl a pact, and the law learned to burn what it could not bless. In more modern light, under the crisp hinge of a cinema door, a different doctrine was preached. A good man bites because the moon tells him to, and silver makes him honest again. The mask changes, but the face beneath does not. Why this creature? Why the wolf? Why us? Because the wolf lives at the margin of the village, of the lamplight, of the law. Because a pack is a kind of family, and a hunt is a kind of prayer. Because, if we are candid, we envy an animal that never apologizes for hunger. It is not the fangs that frighten us, it is their clarity. When we dream of wolves, we are dreaming about permission. When we wake from those dreams, we invent prohibitions. We say, do not eat your own kind. Do not break bread in bad faith. Do not abandon what is human in you even for a night. These are not rules against wolves. They are rules against the speed with which we become them. And yet, beneath the commandments, the old itch remains. Each generation tries to write a cure for it on the skin of the story. Priests name it sin. Physicians file it under melancholy and mania. Jurists bind it to the stake. Poets lay a silver rhyme across it, a bullet of verse. But always the myth returns. Paw prints on the threshold. Because it is not only about what we fear, but about what we desire. Strength without conscience, swiftness without fatigue, certainty without remorse. In the candlelit grammar of folklore, the werewolf is the sentence where that desire is conjugated. I hunger, you howl, he hunts, and then, the real verb, we pay. Imagine the old listeners at the fire, a mother with soot on her fingers, a boy who learned today that the dog will not come when called, a farmer whose hands shake when he thinks of winter stores. Behind them the door bar is set, but the latch lifts at every story's end. That is how tales work. The teller clears a space on the floor with the toe of his boot like a priest at a threshold ritual. He speaks of a traveler who tests a king, of a feast salted with blasphemy, of lightning that makes a new animal in the ruined smoke. He speaks of warriors whose breath steams through wolfskin, of trances that make iron feel like water, of mornings when the ecstasy wears off and leaves a man brittle as frost. He speaks of judges who ask the wrong questions, and pamphlets that turn dread into ink. He speaks of a beast that eats women and children in a French valley, and a hunter who melts his rosary into bullets. He speaks, at last, of a gentleman on a movie screen who hates what he becomes and cannot help becoming it. The boy at the fire sleeps badly that night because the story kept all its promises. So does the farmer, but for a different reason. Esoteric traditions, those that love to thread meaning through symbol like wire through bone, read the legend as a ritual text. The forest is not a place, but a state. The boundary between village and wild is not a fence, but an hour. The wolf is not merely an animal, but an appetite with a ritual mask. In charms and grimoires, you will find the same geometry. Crossroads at midnight, iron in the pocket, a circle salted against trespass. These are not protections from a zoological threat. They are liturgies against impulsive harm. A pentacle may be traced on the threshold, but the shape it tries to bind has already learned to draw inside the ribs. If you study the old calendars, you will notice the story's clockwork. Winters are longer in the tale. Bread goes stale faster. Meat is more suspect. The human voice grows hoarse from pleading. Folklore is weather written down. In lean times, the wolf in us volunteers more quickly. In plague years and famine years and years when armies move like locusts, the accusation of werewolf is another way to say, someone must be paying for this. The scapegoat goes into the woods wearing a skin we have chosen for him, and when he does not come back, we sleep easier for a while. Myth is a machine for converting fear into order. It is also a mirror that shows us the price of that conversion. There is a more intimate reading too, one you can only attempt when the lamp is low. The werewolf is our diary written in a borrowed alphabet. It is the panic we feel when anger takes us, and we hear ourselves from a distance. It is the shame after indulgence, the relief of surrender, the dangerous mercy of forgetting. In the language of the tarot, it is strength reversed, jaws closing on the hand that would soothe them. In the quiet medicine of the monastery, it is confessed as an old compulsion. In the clean glare of the clinic, it is graphed as a spike. Each culture prescribes its own treatment: ashes on the tongue, exile, penance, pills, couples therapy, silver, and still the story persists because nothing else speaks as directly to the simple arithmetic of our lives, that we are two natures braided together, and one of them has better night vision. When we say werewolf, we are not chiefly describing pelts and claws. We are inventing a vocabulary for a recurring human event. The hour when appetite outruns law, when memory is a hindrance, when the moon inside the skull rises, and the careful daytime name you carry does not fit. We call it a curse so we can imagine it can be lifted. We call it a pact so we can pretend it was chosen. We call it an illness so we can prescribe ourselves away from it. All of these are strategies for facing the same door. This, then, is the history we are about to read together by firelight, not of an animal that learned to mimic a man, but of a man who learned to admit an animal. From the palaces of Arcadia to the longhouses of the north, from parish courts to printing presses, and onto the silver screen, the myth changes masks and retains its pulse. The names alter, the fear remains. The true history of the werewolf is the history of what we forbid and what we forgive, of punishments that make monsters and powers that unmake men, of laws written to keep teeth from throats, and stories told to keep hands from shaking. Before we descend the mountain paths into ash altars and trials, before we meet kings turned to hunters and hunters turned to saints, keep one rule near as a charm. The werewolf is not a creature in the forest, but a consequence in the heart. The rest is scenery. The rest is ceremony. The rest is what happens when the door opens. The tale begins not in shadows, but in the marble brilliance of an ancient palace, gleaming with torchlight and perfumed with incense. Yet beneath its columns, cruelty stalked. The story comes to us from the Roman poet Ovid, though it is far older, whispered across centuries of Greek firelit nights. It tells of Lycaon, king of Arcadia, whose arrogance dared to test the very father of the gods. Zeus, disguised as a weary traveler, entered Lycaon's hall to see for himself whether mortals had fallen into wickedness. The law of Xenia hospitality was sacred, older than any written code, a bond between guest and host that even kings were bound to honor. But Lycaon, whose heart was blackened by hubris, decided not to honor, but to mock. First, he plotted to murder the guest as he slept. Then, devising a deeper blasphemy, he killed a human captive, cooked the flesh, and served it to Zeus, daring to see whether the god could discern man from beast. The brazier smoke rose in twisting patterns, meat sizzling in the bowls, and in that act, the palace became a shrine to profanity. To spill blood in such a way was not simply cruelty, it was a violation of cosmic order. Across cultures, the meal is sacred. Bread and salt, shared between strangers, seals a covenant. To corrupt that covenant is to spit in the face of heaven itself. Lycaon's test was not a clever trick. It was a ritual inversion, a parody of sacrifice, a black mass before there was such a phrase. Zeus's disguise crumbled in a blaze of fury. Lightning split the palace roof, turning feasting hall into pyre. Terrified courtiers fled, their shadows leaping across the marble. Lycaon himself ran from the wreckage into the wilds, but escape was never the god's intent. Zeus's punishment was not swift death, it was transformation judgment carved into flesh. As he stumbled into the night, his body tore against itself. Skin bristled into coarse grey fur, muscles knotted, hands split into paws clawed and merciless. His noble face lengthened into a snarling muzzle, fangs bared in a howl that shook the valleys of Arcadia. His robes shredded, becoming no more than rags clinging to a beast. He was still Lycaon, trapped in his own mind, but his body was wolf, cursed to roam forever, as the very animal whose hunger he had mocked. Here is the seed of the werewolf myth. Transformation, not as gift, but as retribution. The gods shaped punishment into the shape of appetite. If Lycaon acted as beast, then beast he would be forever hunted by his own instincts. This story is more than myth. It is a lesson dressed in fur and blood. Arrogance invites judgment. Across folklore we see the same pattern. Those who dare to break the sacred boundary of meal, of flesh, of kinship, find themselves unmade. In the darkened halls of Europe's later witch trials, this structure would echo. Blasphemy punished by metamorphosis, human will undone by divine or demonic power. But in Lycaon's fate, there is also something more terrible. He is not annihilated but preserved. His consciousness remains, shackled to the beast's body. To be a wolf without forgetting humanity is the truest curse. It is not the loss of the self, it is the imprisonment of the self inside something monstrous. That paradox, the mind of a man, the form of a wolf, became the foundation upon which centuries of werewolf tales would stand. In the hush of night, when winds whistled through olive groves, villagers retold the tale as warning. The king became myth, the myth became omen, and the omen hardened into archetype. It told every listener, beware the arrogance that mocks the divine, for punishment may not come as thunder in the sky, but as the beast rising beneath your own skin. Thus, from one king's blasphemy, a shadow spread across time. Lycaon, the Wolf King, did not merely haunt Arcadia. He stalks still in the imagination, the first cursed of his kind, the eternal reminder that the line between feast and famine, between prayer and profanity, between man and wolf, is thinner than a hair caught in firelight. Beyond the palace ruins of Lycaon's tale lies a mountain feared for centuries, Mount Lycæus in Arcadia, a peak where gods and mortals converged in shadows. The myth of the Wolf King, was not only a cautionary parable but also a veil draped over something older, darker, and far more unsettling, a ritual whispered by ancient Greeks, a ceremony that blurred the boundary between man and beast. Here, high above the valleys, the cult of Zeus Lycaeus, the wolf Zeus, was said to gather. The name itself was a warning. Not the Zeus of thunder and law, but a more primal aspect, wolfish and untamed, seated in smoke and blood. Upon the ash altar of this mountain, rites were performed that chilled even the chroniclers of antiquity. Pausanias, the traveler and historian, spoke of it as a forbidden precinct, a place where no mortal could trespass without courting death within the year. The accounts are fragmented, like torn pages of a darker scripture. They tell of sacrifices laid upon the altar, human entrails mingled with those of beasts, cooked into a single grisly feast. The cultists, priests, initiates, or perhaps madmen would partake of this mingled flesh, each bite a gamble with destiny, for hidden within the stew was a curse. Whoever unknowingly consumed the human portion would, by divine judgment, shed his humanity and take the form of a wolf. Imagine it, the flicker of torches against black stone, the scent of burning fat carried on the mountain winds, chants rising into the night sky. A man raises the cup to his lips, unaware of the fate within. One bite, one swallow, and his body betrays him, fur tearing from skin, jaws snapping where prayers once spoke. His brothers recoil, yet in awe, for the god has chosen his vessel. The man is no longer man. He is wolf, driven into the wilderness to wander under the gaze of the wolf Zeus. But there was a grim balance to this curse. It was not always eternal. In certain versions, the condemned werewolves could return to their human forms if they endured. 9 years they must roam the wilds, resisting every temptation to feast on human flesh. Only if they abstained, only if they conquered their monstrous hunger, would they be restored on the 10th year, cleansed and reborn into humanity. Fail, and the wolf would claim them forever. The symbolism here is stark and unsettling. The rite was not merely punishment, it was initiation, a liminal passage through savagery and self-restraint, echoing the initiatory ordeals of shamans, warriors, and priests across cultures. To be exiled into the wilderness as a beast was to descend into chaos, only to return, if at all purified by suffering, a being who had stared into the abyss of appetite and survived. It is no wonder the ancients wrapped this ritual in secrecy. The Lycaea was not for the uninitiated. It was a mystery cult, where the line between sacrifice and blasphemy, between worship and horror, dissolved. The altar itself, archaeologists now believe, was layered with centuries of ash bone fragments, animal and perhaps human alike, ground into the very soil of the peak. When modern excavations unearthed them, the mountain spoke again, its silence broken by the brittle crack of ancient skeletons. Across the world, we find echoes of such dark initiations. Among the Celts, tales of druids consuming flesh to gain visions. Among the Aztecs, hearts torn from victims to feed the Sunday. Among Siberian shamans, journeys into the skin of the beast to speak with spirits. Mount Lycæus was Greece's shadow temple, where men tested the fragile boundary between divinity and monstrosity. Here, then, lies the second great layer of the werewolf myth, not simply a curse hurled in wrath, but a ritual doorway, opened by choice or by fate. To partake of forbidden flesh was to risk the wolf's embrace. To resist the hunger was to reclaim one's soul. In the dark torchlight of Lycæus, we see not only punishment but initiation, a ritual map of the human struggle with appetite, sin, and the dangerous seduction of power. And so the myth lingers, stitched into both history and bone, a feast of gods and men, a test of restraint, a secret rite on a haunted mountain. The wolf was not merely punishment, it was a sacrament. And those who joined the rite, whether willingly or by doom, became the first brothers of the wolf, the ancients spoke of a grim condition that accompanied the wolf curse. It was not always forever. For those who had consumed human flesh in the ritual of Mount Lycæus, a dreadful bargain unfolded. 9 long years to wander as a beast, 9 winters and 9 summers to resist the gnawing hunger that had condemned them. If, through this exile, the cursed abstained from eating human flesh again, they might return to their human form on the 10th year, fail, and the wolf would claim them eternally. This was no simple punishment. It was a trial, a cruel pilgrimage through shadow and solitude. Imagine the cursed man, once noble or humble, cast naked into the forests of Arcadia, his body bristling with fur, his voice stolen by a howl. He stalks the wilderness where no hearth fire warms, where no hand dares touch him. At first, his mind remains his own, horrified at the transformation. But as the months turn, instinct gnaws. The smell of blood in the air tempts him. The cries of travelers in the night become invitations. His very survival urges him to break the vow and complete his damnation. Yet in this torment lies something more profound. This 9-year exile is not only punishment, it is an ordeal of purification. Across cultures, we see echoes. The shaman who lives in caves until visions come. The desert hermit tested by demons of hunger and thirst. The knight-errant wandering barren lands until his penance is complete. To live as a wolf for 9 years was to be plunged into the wilderness of the soul, to strip away the comforts of fire, bread, and kinship, until nothing remains but will. In this symbolism, the werewolf is more than a monster. It is a liminal being, balanced between man and beast, sin and redemption. The cursed one walks the shadow path, where every decision sharpens the divide between salvation and ruin. Abstinence becomes a sacred act, each resisted temptation a prayer not spoken but endured. Picture him on the 9th winter's night, gaunt, fur ragged, eyes hollow yet burning with hunger. The moon rides high, silver and merciless. Deer pass before him, and he hunts. But when the scent of a human campfire drifts across the pines, he turns away trembling. For 9 years he has lived as death's shadow, yet never tasted forbidden flesh again. When the 10th dawn breaks, his body convulses. Fur recedes. Claws draw back into fingers. The howl falters into a cry human again, though forever marked by the memory of the beast. This redemption is rare, but it reveals something haunting. The myth understood the beast not only as curse but as trial. The wolf was both prison and teacher. To resist its hunger was to become more human than before, a survivor of one's own darkest nature. To yield was to lose the soul, to vanish into the pack of beasts that roam forever in shadow. The 9 years of the werewolf tell us something universal. They speak of time as crucible, of wilderness as purgatory, of appetite as the oldest battlefield of the human heart. The Greeks encoded this not as fantasy but as moral geometry. A man who eats his own kind becomes beast. A beast who abstains from further sin becomes man again. Thus the curse of the wolf was also a mirror. It showed what we are when stripped of all but hunger. It asked, in the language of fur and fang, whether humanity is fragile costume or choice made. Night after night, in the dark. Centuries after poets first wrote of Lycaon and the dark rites of Mount Lycæus, the mountain itself began to speak. Archaeologists, climbing its barren slopes and windswept summit, uncovered the traces of what the ancients had only whispered. A great ash altar, blackened by centuries of fire, layered deep with bone and charred remains. It was not myth alone, it was ritual, preserved in stone and cinder. The altar was vast, built not for a single offering, but for generations of sacrifices. Piled high were the remnants of animals, goats, sheep, perhaps deer, all creatures bound to Zeus in worship. But in 2016, the earth revealed something far more disturbing. Buried among the layers of ash lay the skeleton of a boy, no older than a teenager, curled within the sacrificial soil. 3,000 years he had lain hidden. His bones mingled with the traces of fire and offering. Scholars could not say with certainty whether his presence was accident or intention, but the implication was chilling. If this was sacrifice, then the legends of human offerings on Lycæus were not mere stories. They were history. Imagine the scene: a torchlit procession winding up the mountain, the air thin and cold, the silence broken by chanting. At the summit, before the altar of ash, priests in wolf masks prepare the offering. The boy, trembling in the dark, becomes the bridge between man and God, his life fed to the flame. Around him, others partake of the ritual meal, their fate hanging on what portion they consume. The mountain watches. The god waits. Somewhere, a man will leave that place not as man, but as wolf. Such finds blur the line between myth and fact. Was the myth of Lycaon born from memory of actual rites? Were the stories of transformation parables meant to explain, even excuse, the horror of ritual cannibalism? If so, the werewolf is not just a beast of imagination, but the cultural mask placed over acts too terrible to speak plainly. The wolf, in this reading, is the body of guilt itself, the shape sin takes when a people seeks to make sense of their own shadows. The bones at Lycæus whisper this truth, that myths are not lies but memory clothed in symbols. They are the echo of firelight over ancient stone, the retelling of blood that once stained the altar. To discover human remains in that sacred ash is to hear the growl of the story beneath history's soil. The ancients themselves feared the place. Pausanias wrote that any who trespassed in the precinct of the wolf Zeus would not survive the year. This was no superstition. It was dread woven into landscape, a warning encoded into myth to keep the curious away from what the cult performed in secret. And yet, millennia later, the earth betrayed them, unsealing their rites for modern eyes. The discovery is a reminder. The werewolf's first domain was not cinema or fable, but altar and tomb. Its first victims were not fictional, but flesh and bone. When we speak of the Wolfman of Arcadia, we are not merely repeating Ovid's tale. We are standing among the ashes, where human and animal remains still mingle, where the mountain holds its secrets but not forever. In that silence, broken only by wind, we feel the weight of the myth as it was meant to be felt, not as entertainment, but as warning. The wolf is not invention. It is the mask of something real, something done by human hands, justified by divine hunger. The altar smolders still, even cold, in the imagination. If Greece gave us the werewolf as punishment, the North gave us the werewolf as power. Among the sagas of the Vikings, the wolf was not a curse to be feared, but a spirit to be invoked, a sacred fury to be worn into battle like armor. Where the Greeks spoke of Zeus's judgment, the Norse spoke of Odin's blessing, and in that difference the werewolf took on its second great shape, not the condemned beast, but the chosen warrior. The sagas tell of the Ulfethnar literally, wolf hides. They were no ordinary fighters, but an elite brotherhood who wrapped themselves in wolf pelts and entered the battlefield as something more than men. These warriors belonged to Odin, the All-Father, god of death, wisdom, and ecstasy. At his feet crouched two wolves, Jerry and Freki, the ravenous and the greedy, who devoured the meat from his table. To wear the wolfskin was to align oneself with those sacred beasts, to claim their hunger and their ferocity as a shield. But this was no mere costume. The wolf hide was ritual, a key to a trance as old as shamanism. Before battle, the Ulfhednar would enter the Berserker gang, the Berserk fury, through chants, drums, and sometimes strange brews. Their eyes would roll back, foam would fleck their lips, their jaws gnashing against the iron rims of their shields. To their enemies, they looked less like men than possessed creatures, half human, half beast, unstoppable in their frenzy. The sagas say that in this state neither fire nor iron could harm them, as though Odin himself had sealed their flesh. Picture them in the dawn mist, ranks of armored warriors trembling before the howls of men cloaked in wolf pelts, eyes blazing, voices roar with bestial cries. When they charged, it was as though the forest itself had broken loose, a pack descending upon the field. To see them coming was to see death advancing on 4 legs disguised as 2. This was not madness, but method. The berserk fury was a weapon as sharp as any sword. In surrendering to the wolf, the warrior shed the limitations of fear and pain. He became an instrument of terror, a living embodiment of chaos unleashed. This was no shame to the Norse, it was sacred. The wolf was the mask of Odin's power, the howl a prayer of rage. Other cultures tell of similar bonds between man and beast. Siberian shamans spoke of leaving their bodies to roam as wolves. In Central Asia, steppe warriors wore the pelts of predators, believing they carried the animal's soul. But the Norse alone made of it an army, a brotherhood who lived and died by the wolf's strength. Thus, from the fjords and frost, a new archetype of the werewolf was born. Not cursed sinner, but divine killer. Not exile, but champion. In the sagas, the man who became wolf did so willingly, for glory, for God, for the taste of fear in his enemies' throats. The werewolf here was not warning, but weapon, a power to be taken, channeled, and feared. And so the myth stretched its skin further. In Greece, the wolf was judgment. In Arcadia, it was sacrament. In the north, it was fury itself, riding the breath of Odin. Together these strands braided into one creature, a man who crosses the boundary of his own humanity, sometimes by curse, sometimes by choice, always at terrible cost. The sagas speak in thunder, yet their echoes are filled with silence, the silence of what happens after the battle is done. For the Ulfhethnar, the wolf warriors of Odin, the frenzy of combat was intoxicating, a divine storm that made them invulnerable, unstoppable. But storms always pass. And when the fury ebbed, when the howls quieted and the wolfskins were laid aside, what remained was not triumph but exhaustion, fear, and the heavy shadow of a curse. The berserker trance was more than a battlefield tactic. It was an opening of the self, a surrender to the spirit of the wolf and the ecstasy of Odin. The man became something else, an instrument of carnage that no sword could touch. Yet to borrow the power of gods and beasts was to pay a debt, and payment was demanded not in coin, but in humanity. When the trance faded, warriors collapsed into weakness. Wounds they had not felt now burned like fire. Minds that had been drowned in rage returned broken, drifting between stupor and despair. Some sagas describe days when these warriors could not rise from their beds, trembling like children after having torn through armies like beasts. The community admired them in war, but in peace they were dangerous. For how can a man who has surrendered his humanity so completely ever be trusted again to live quietly among neighbors? The sagas are filled with whispers of berserkers, who struck down friends in sudden rages, who turned feasts into funerals, who carried the wolf with them long after the battlefield was gone. A power that made them heroes in war made them monsters at home. This duality, the sacred and the savage intertwined, is what transforms the Norse wolf warrior into a prototype of the tragic werewolf. The curse was not inflicted by Zeus or by demons. It was born from within, from the very ritual that granted them strength. The wolfskin did not merely disguise them, it rewrote their souls. To be Ulfhethnar was to live in a constant tension between man and beast, order and chaos, kinship and exile. Imagine one such warrior returning from battle. The village welcomes him with feasting, songs sung to Odin for the victory. But as the mead flows, his eyes darken. He begins to shake, teeth gnashing, the echo of battle fury rising unbidden. Children hide, mothers gather their sons close. The warrior strikes the table, splits wood with his bare hands, howls at shadows only he can see. He has left the battlefield, but the battlefield has not left him. By dawn, he may be calm again, weeping at his own violence, but the memory lingers. The wolf does not sleep easily once woken. The sagas also tell of how society responded. As kings consolidated power and Christianity spread through Scandinavia, the Berserker cult became less tolerated, more feared. Once celebrated as Odin's chosen, the Ulfhethnar gradually became outcasts. The law codes of Iceland and Norway eventually criminalized the Berserker gang itself. To fall into the battle fury was no longer a sign of divine favor. It was a crime punishable by exile. Those who had once led charges in Odin's name were driven into the margins of society, feared as much as the outlaws and witches who wandered the wild. Their wolfskins marked them not as heroes but as pariahs. Here we glimpse the same pattern that runs through so much folklore. Power that first appears sacred eventually becomes taboo. What once was ritual becomes crime. The ecstatic warrior becomes the cursed man. In this arc lies the heart of the werewolf myth, the danger of yielding too much to the beast within, even in the name of gods. But there is also a deeper symbolism. The Berserker's fury, like Lycaon's punishment, is a mirror of humanity's oldest fear, that beneath our fragile order lies a chaos we cannot control. In Greece, the chaos was unleashed by hubris at the table. In the north, by ecstasy on the battlefield. Both remind us that the line between human and beast is thin, and crossing it always has a price. Anthropologists have compared the Berserker trance to shamanic possession rituals across Siberia and Central Asia. In those cultures, the shaman would allow their soul to journey into the form of an animal, sometimes wolf, sometimes bear, to speak with spirits or wage battles in the unseen world. But unlike shamans, who returned to heal their community, the Berserkers often returned only to harm it. Their possession was not guided by healing, but by slaughter, and so the community eventually rejected them. Power, without restraint, becomes curse. The Christian chroniclers, too, saw in the Berserkers a kind of demonic influence. To them, these men were not blessed by Odin, but tormented by Satan, driven mad by unnatural fury. In later retellings, the wolfskin became not just a garment, but a pact, a sign of devilry. Here, the old pagan wolf warrior was seamlessly folded into the Christian idea of the werewolf as heretic and witch. What was once sacred ecstasy became evidence of diabolical transformation. In this way, the story of the Ulfhethnar bridges the gap between the pagan wolf of power and the Christian wolf of damnation. They are the missing link in the myth's evolution, showing us how society's lens determines whether the beast within is honored or hunted. In one age, they were Odin's chosen, their howls a hymn. In another, they were outlaws, their howls an abomination. Yet the echo of their tragedy remains timeless. To hold such immense strength and be destroyed by it is the fate of many who pursue power too far. The Berserkers embody a paradox that haunts the werewolf myth in every era. The beast within grants victory but steals peace, brings glory but demands exile, saves the community in war but threatens it in peace. This is the birth of the tragic werewolf, not a villain bitten by curse, not a sinner punished by gods, but a man undone by the very power he sought. He is not condemned by others, but by his own nature. And in that mirror, we recognize ourselves, the endless struggle between control and surrender, reason and rage, man and wolf. Thus, the Norse gave us more than warriors. They gave us an archetype that still stalks the forests of imagination, the hero cursed not by enemies, but by the victory of his own inner beast. In their rise and fall, we see the eternal truth of the werewolf story, that power, once unleashed, can never truly be caged again. The age of the pagan wolf faded slowly, like embers cooling after the pyre. By the time Christianity spread across Europe, the old gods of Greece and the North were buried beneath church bells and holy water. Yet the wolf, that restless spectre of appetite and transformation, did not die. It merely learned a new mask. Where once it had been a curse from Zeus or a gift from Odin, it now became something far darker, the sign of a pact with the devil. In the Christian imagination, there could be no middle ground. Power came either from God or from Satan. And since the wolf could not be reconciled with the God of heaven, it was branded as hell's emissary, the devil's beast. The werewolf was no longer a tragic victim or an ecstatic warrior. He was a heretic, a witch, a willing servant of the Prince of Darkness. The theologians of the medieval age wrote of it with certainty. To become a wolf, one must renounce baptism, spit upon the cross, and swear allegiance to the enemy. In exchange, Satan would grant the gift of shape-shifting. The old wolf skin of Odin became a wolf girdle, a belt woven by the devil's hand. The salves and ointments of shamanic trance became filters, brewed at the witch's Sabbath, thick with herbs and blood. Rituals at the altar of Zeus became grotesque parodies of Christian sacraments. Black masses at crossroads, candles of human fat, prayers said backwards, wine soured into poison. The change was profound. In pagan myth, the werewolf was a liminal figure, part man, part beast, caught between hunger and redemption. But in the Christian age, there was no redemption. To don the wolf's shape was to choose evil, to give one's soul over to Satan. Every transformation was proof of heresy. Every howl in the night was a voice in the devil's choir. Imagine a medieval village, half buried in snow. Crops have failed, livestock lie dead, children vanish in the woods. Fear seeks a face to blame. The priest stands in the churchyard, preaching that the devil stalks in wolf's form, and that his servants hide among the people. Suddenly, the strange man who lives beyond the fields is no longer just an outsider, he is a werewolf. The widow who gathers herbs at midnight is not merely a healer, she is a witch. Suspicion becomes scripture, and accusation becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. The werewolf trials began, paralleling the witch hunts that swept across Europe. Confessions were extracted under torture, and the details were horrifyingly consistent. Men swore they had been approached by a black figure in the woods, a phantom who promised food, wealth, or strength. In return, they received ointments or belts that allowed them to change. Some confessed they hunted with Satan's pack, devouring livestock and children alike. Others admitted to grotesque rituals, gathering at crossroads with candles that sputtered against the wind, bowing before a horned figure, drinking wine that tasted of ashes. It is tempting to dismiss these confessions as fantasy born of agony and coercion, yet they reveal something deeper. The medieval mind could only understand transformation through the lens of sin. What the Greeks had seen as hubris punished, what the Norse had seen as divine ecstasy, the Christian saw as blasphemy incarnate. The werewolf had become not just a beast, but evidence of a theological war, proof that Satan still roamed the earth in flesh and claw. The atmosphere of these trials was gothic in every sense. Picture the courtroom lit by guttering candles, the accused bound in chains, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Judges in black robes whisper prayers, while scribes scratch down every confession, every detail of the devil's ointments, every pact sealed in blood. Outside, villagers cross themselves, whispering of shadows on the moors and the howl that carried across the churchyard last night. In such a world, the line between folklore and fact vanished. The werewolf was as real as the gallows. This shift also birthed some of the darkest symbols in the werewolf tradition. The pentagram, once a pagan star of harmony, became the devil's mark. To bear it upon the skin was to show allegiance to hell. The wolf's howl, once a battle cry of Odin's chosen, became a demonic trumpet announcing Satan's hunt. Even the moon, ancient symbol of mystery, was reframed as the devil's lamp, under which witches and werewolves alike danced in the Sabbath frenzy. Yet behind this fear lay a deeper social function. The werewolf accusation was a tool of control. It allowed church and state to identify outsiders, to purge the unwanted, to turn famine and plague into stories of satanic conspiracy. The community could believe that its suffering was not random, but the work of a beast in their midst, one that could be found, tried, and burned. In this way, the werewolf became a scapegoat, not only in story but in law. But what of the accused? Many were poor, desperate, hungry. A hermit who stole food might be said to have hunted as a wolf. A shepherd boy caught in lies might claim the devil gave him a skin. Under torture, they confessed not only to crimes, but to monstrous hungers that perhaps reflected the despair of starvation itself. The devil offered them meat in the woods. They accepted, for in truth they had none at home. And thus hunger, sin, and fear were braided together into the shape of a wolf. So the myth shifted once more. No longer a pagan mystery, no longer a divine frenzy. The werewolf of Christendom was a creature of damnation, a visible face of the devil's war upon the faithful. To hunt a werewolf was to defend the church. To burn one was to purify the land. In the smoke of those pyres rose a new archetype, the werewolf as Satan's soldier, the beast whose claws carried the weight of heresy itself. It is in this age of fire and fear that the werewolf legend became inseparable from witchcraft. They were no longer creatures of folklore. They were criminals, heretics, enemies of God. And this transformation in the myth was no accident. It was the reflection of a world trembling on the edge of famine, plague, and schism, desperate for enemies it could name and destroy. The devil's werewolf was born not in the forests, but in the courts, not in the howl of the wild, but in the accusations of frightened neighbors. It was forged from fear, hammered by theology, sharpened by law. And though centuries have passed, its shadow still lingers. The image of the beast as conscious servant of evil, stalking the night not because it must, but because it chose to. The devil's werewolf was not just a story whispered in taverns or pulpits. It was dragged into the courts, chained in cells, and burned before the eyes of entire villages. The fear that once lived in myth became written law, and with it, Europe entered one of its darkest periods, the werewolf trials. If the Greeks warned of gods punishing hubris, and the Norse praised wolf fury as divine ecstasy, Christendom created a new theater of horror, where hunger, suspicion, and heresy converged in fire. The year was 1573 inches. Dole, France, a town shadowed by terror. Children had vanished, their bodies found mutilated at the edges of fields. Whispers grew into certainty. A wolf, but not a mere animal, one of Satan's beasts. A loup, garou. Desperation turned the countryside into a hunting ground, and villagers scoured forests with pikes and torches. Their quarry led them to the hut of Gilles Garnier, a hermit who lived on the outskirts of society. He was poor, gaunt, a stranger even to his neighbors. That was enough. Arrested and dragged before the magistrates, Garnier confessed not freely, but under pressure that bent the will like iron over flame. He told a tale that both horrified and confirmed the villagers' worst fears. One evening, starving in the woods, he said a phantom had appeared. The figure promised him meat, power, and survival. It gave him an ointment, and when he rubbed it on his body, he could become a wolf at will. In this form, he stalked the countryside, killing children and carrying their flesh home to his wife. 50 witnesses came forward to speak against him. Some swore they had seen a wolf that, when wounded, limped like Garnier. Others claimed they had spied him dragging corpses. Still others whispered of his strange mutterings, his avoidance of holy mass, his hermit's strangeness. In such a climate, testimony became fuel for fire and suspicion proof. Garnier was convicted of lycanthropy and witchcraft, sentenced to be burned alive. The pyre roared, and with it, a new precedent was set. Werewolves were not merely myth, they were criminals, heretics, threats to order itself. But this was only the beginning. 16 years later, in Germany, came the most infamous case of all, Peter Stumpp, the werewolf of Bedburg. For 25 years, the countryside had been haunted by brutal killings of livestock, women, and children. Rumors of a monstrous wolf spread through villages, and finally, in 1589, hunters cornered the beast. When it was captured, witnesses claimed it transformed back into Stumpp, a wealthy farmer with little love from his neighbors. Under the rack, Stumpp confessed to horrors beyond comprehension. At 12 years old, he claimed, he had made a pact with the devil. In exchange for his soul, he received a wolf's girdle, a belt of black fur that, when buckled around his waist, transformed him into a wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes of fire. For decades, he used this power to slaughter animals and humans alike. He admitted to killing and eating 13 children, 2 pregnant women, and even his own son. He confessed to incest, cannibalism, and desecrations so vile that pamphlets described them as monstrous sins not to be named. And his trial became spectacle. A pamphlet published soon after spread the story across Germany, and even to London, complete with lurid woodcuts of Stumpp's tortures. The text portrayed him not as man, but as devil incarnate, a walking lesson in heresy and sin. He was executed with savage ceremony, flesh torn with red-hot pincers, limbs broken on the wheel, head severed and mounted. His daughter and mistress burned beside him as accomplices. The wolf girdle, said to have vanished when he was captured, was proof enough for many that the devil himself had claimed it back. But if Garnier and Stumpp were monsters in the eyes of their age, to us they are symbols of something more complex. Their confessions, wrung from agony, reflect less the crimes of individuals than the fears of entire societies. Famine stalked Europe, wars tore villages apart, plagues left streets silent. The werewolf became the perfect scapegoat, an embodiment of chaos that could be captured, judged, and destroyed. The community's terror was poured into a single figure, whose execution promised a return to order. These trials reveal the werewolf's final transformation in medieval thought, from folkloric creature to legal category, from fireside tale to executioner's sentence. To be accused of lycanthropy was to be placed outside the human community, to be cast into a realm where law and faith demanded fire. The wolf was no longer simply lurking in forests. It was believed to dwell in the hearts of neighbors, ready to betray kin for Satan's promise. Picture the atmosphere of such trials. A candlelit courtroom heavy with incense, judges frowning over parchment, the accused trembling in chains. Outside, the villagers gather, clutching rosaries, whispering prayers that their children will be spared. In the silence before the sentence, the crackle of the pyre already hums in their imagination. To condemn the accused is not only to punish it, is to exorcise the fear that has gnawed at their community for months or years. And so, across France, Germany, and Switzerland, dozens of men and women were accused, tortured, and executed as werewolves. Some claimed ointments, some belts, some pacts with shadowy figures in the woods. Others denied everything to the end, but denial mattered little. The law had learned to see wolves where it wished. The werewolf, once a myth of gods and warriors, had become a legal fiction, a crime punishable by death. Its trials were not about truth, but about fear. They were fires meant to cleanse, scapegoats meant to reassure, confessions meant to shape the world into a drama of God versus devil, with human flesh as the stage. Yet beneath the ashes lies a chilling realization. The beast that haunted Europe was not a wolf, but hunger, suspicion, and the need for enemies. Garnier, Stumpp, and countless others became sacrifices in a theater of fire, their humanity burned away by law and legend alike. The werewolf was no longer an ancient curse, it was a sentence, written in ink, signed by judges, carried out in flame. Between 1764 and 1767, a region of south-central France fell under the shadow of a predator so relentless, so bloodthirsty, that its legend would outlive even the royal hunters sent to kill it. This was the beast of Gévaudan, a terror that ravaged villages, haunted forests, and left more than 100 corpses in its wake. To this day, no one knows exactly what it was, wolf, hybrid, or something stranger, but the echoes of its howl still carry through the folklore of Europe like a wound that never healed. It began in the rolling hills and valleys of Gévaudan, a poor rural province where peasants clung to survival in the shadow of the Cévennes mountains. In the summer of 1764, reports spread of a monstrous creature attacking women and children as they tended sheep and gathered wood. Survivors described it as larger than any wolf, with reddish-brown fur, a chest broad as a bull, a tail long and powerful, and eyes that gleamed like fire. Some swore it leapt with supernatural speed. Others said its hide turned away bullets. And always, it went for the throat. By autumn, panic gripped the countryside. Farmers found mutilated corpses, throats torn, heads crushed, entrails devoured. Priests thundered from pulpits that God had loosed a scourge upon them, punishment for sins unrepented. Peasants muttered of demons, of Satan himself in beast's form, of werewolves stalking under the moon. A fog of dread settled over Gévaudan, thick as the mists that curled through its forests. The killings multiplied. The beast seemed to prefer women and children, those least able to defend themselves. Eyewitnesses swore it showed cunning beyond animal instinct, luring shepherdesses away, stalking hunters with uncanny patience. Its reign of terror was so devastating that it drew the attention of the French crown itself. In 1765, King Louis XV dispatched his best royal huntsmen and even offered a great reward to whoever slew the monster. Suddenly, the tragedy of Gévaudan became not just a local nightmare, but a matter of national pride. The hunt began. Soldiers scoured the forests with muskets. Noblemen rode with packs of hounds. Villagers armed themselves with pikes and traps. The countryside echoed with gunfire and prayers. Yet the beast continued to kill. One survivor, the young Marie-Jeanne Vallée, earned fame when she fought it off with a bayonet-tipped staff, stabbing it in the chest and driving it back into the woods. Songs were written of her bravery, but the beast endured, as though mockingly invulnerable. At last, in June of 1767, a local hunter named Jean Chastel delivered the killing blow. According to later accounts, he loaded his musket not with ordinary shot but with bullets of silver, melted down from a blessed medal of the Virgin Mary. The beast fell at his feet, riddled with wounds, and was carted away for display. Its carcass was paraded before officials, then buried quietly in the mountains. With its death, the killings ceased. Yet the mystery had only begun. What was the beast? Some claimed it was merely a wolf of unusual size, though no wolf had ever killed with such consistency or cunning. Others whispered it was a hybrid, a wolf dog, or even a lion escaped from some exotic menagerie. Some darker theories suggested a man was behind the murders, using a trained animal to attack victims, cloaking his crimes in superstition. The idea of a serial killer behind the legend still lingers in speculation. But for the peasants of Gévaudan, the truth was simpler. It had been a werewolf, and it had been slain with holy silver. This detail, the silver bullet, marks one of the most enduring legacies of the beast. Nowhere in older folklore was silver a common weapon against werewolves. It was iron, fire, or beheading that destroyed them. But the tale of Chastel's silver shot, blessed by a priest and fired in faith, entered the bloodstream of legend. It would pass from peasant tale to printed pamphlet, and from pamphlet to later fiction, until Hollywood enshrined it as the eternal law. Only silver can kill the wolf. The beast of Gévaudan was not merely a killer, it was a mirror of its age. The Enlightenment had dawned, yet in the rural valleys of France, reason and superstition danced uneasily together. On one hand, the state responded with soldiers, organized hunts, and royal proclamations. On the other, villagers left offerings at shrines, whispered charms against wolves, and spoke of demons in the woods. The beast became a crucible where faith, fear, and science collided. It was a monster that existed both in the natural world and in the supernatural imagination. Picture the landscape: fog, shrouded forests, peasants clutching rosaries as they trudged to fields, muskets gleaming in the hands of soldiers, and behind it all, the whisper that the devil had taken flesh in fur and fang. Every howl in the night was not only an animal call but a sermon, a reminder that God's protection was fragile, that evil might wear a shape as simple as a wolf. When the beast finally fell, Gévaudan breathed easier, but its story did not die. Pamphlets spread across Europe, filled with lurid woodcuts of monstrous wolves devouring women, of heroic hunters firing silver into the night. The image of the beast, crouched with bloody jaws, became one of the first viral horrors of the modern age, carried not by rumor alone but by print and song. The true identity of the beast may never be known. Was it a pack of unusually large wolves, a lone hybrid predator, a criminal cloaked in fur, or something stranger still? Theories abound, but the mystery is precisely what fuels its legend. The beast of Gévaudan is less a zoological puzzle than a folkloric crucible, a point where fear, faith, and fact fused into myth. And within that myth, the werewolf was reborn, not as king cursed by Zeus, nor as berserker of Odin, nor as heretic bound to the devil, but as a predator that straddled two ages, the fading world of superstition and the rising world of science. The beast was hunted by both priests and soldiers, prayed against in churches and measured by naturalists. It belonged to both worlds, and to neither. Even now, the forests of Gévaudan feel haunted. Tourists visit statues of the beast. Storytellers still recount its terror, and the memory of its victims lingers in parish records. The peasants of the 18th century knew the truth in their bones. Whether wolf, demon, or man, the beast was a lesson written in blood, that the wolf is never entirely gone, that the darkness always waits at the tree line, that in every age, the monster takes the shape we most fear and most deserve. By the late 18th century, the wolf had passed from the courtroom to the printing press, and from the forest to the flickering lantern light of imagination. Yet the myth was not finished evolving. A century later, with the rise of literature and then cinema, the werewolf would be reshaped once more, this time into the form we know best today, a creature bound to the full moon and slain only by silver. What is striking is that neither of these rules comes from ancient lore. In the Greek myths of Lycaeon, there was no lunar cycle. In the Norse sagas, the Ulfhethnar transformed by choice, through trance and ritual. In the witch trials, accused werewolves used ointments, belts, or pacts, never moonlight. And yet, when Universal Studios released The Wolfman in 1941, screenwriter Kurt Siodmak invented two ideas that would become eternal: the curse of the full moon and the weapon of silver. The silver bullet was not wholly new. Its roots can be traced to the legend of the beast of Gévaudan, where Jean Chastel was said to have fired a blessed silver ball to slay the monster. The symbolism was powerful. Silver, the purest of metals, associated with the Virgin Mary, the moon, and with protection against witches. To fire silver was to purify with light, to pierce corruption with incorruptible metal. In an age when bullets represented the triumph of modernity, the silver bullet married technology to myth, science to sanctity. The moon, too, carried its own resonance. For millennia, it had been linked with madness, hence lunacy, from luna. Its cycles governed tides, harvests, even women's bodies. To bind the werewolf's transformation to the full moon was narrative genius. It gave the curse a rhythm, a fateful inevitability. No longer could the wolf appear at random. Its coming was a cosmic appointment. The moon became not only backdrop but tyrant, a glowing clock that marked the hour of doom. Together, these inventions created a new archetype, the tragic werewolf, a man cursed against his will, who dreads the rising moon and knows that only death by silver can release him. This was a sharp departure from earlier traditions. The werewolf of the witch trials was a willing servant of Satan. The Ulfhethnar embraced transformation as sacred power. But Hollywood gave us a sympathetic figure, a good man undone by forces beyond his control. Audiences pitied him as much as they feared him. The imagery was unforgettable. a bright moon shining through skeletal branches. A man writhing as hair bursts from his skin, claws curling, eyes blazing. A hunter raising a polished bullet, its surface gleaming like frozen light, before pulling the trigger. These motifs became so compelling that they overwrote centuries of older folklore. Ask anyone today how to kill a werewolf, and the answer will not be fire or decapitation, but silver. Ask when the werewolf appears, and they will say, at the full moon. The Hollywood inventions became global truths. Symbolically, these new laws deepened the myth. The full moon represents inevitability, the cycle of time, fate that cannot be resisted. It turns the werewolf into a figure of tragic determinism. No matter how noble he is, when the moon rises, the beast awakens. The silver bullet, meanwhile, represents purity through violence, salvation through destruction. It is not enough to cage the wolf or reason with him, he must be annihilated. Only incorruptible silver, shot straight through the heart, can restore balance. Thus, the modern werewolf is a paradox, a victim cursed without choice, and yet a monster doomed without cure. He reflects both our sympathy for human frailty and our terror of the animal within. He is man and beast, sinner and innocent, bound by the moon above and hunted by the bullet below. From the blood-stained altar of Lycaeon to the pamphlets of Peter Stumpp, the werewolf had shifted many times. But it was Hollywood, with its silver screen and silver bullets, that forged the final chains of the myth. Chains of moonlight, chains of silver, chains we still recognize today, every time we look up at the round, merciless eye of the night sky. The story of the werewolf begins in the ash of pagan altars and ends in the flickering reels of Hollywood, but its power has never belonged solely to myth. Beneath every claw and howl lies something far closer, far more unsettling, the beast inside ourselves. To speak of werewolves is to speak of appetite, rage, and the thin fabric of civility stretched over our hungers. It is a mirror held to the human soul, showing us not what we wish to be, but what we fear we already are. In the modern age, scholars and physicians have searched for natural explanations. Some point to rabies, the ancient terror of the wolf's bite, whose symptoms frothing at the mouth, violent aggression, the urge to bite mirror perfectly, the folklore of the wolfman. Others look to the rare psychiatric phenomenon called clinical lycanthropy, in which sufferers are convinced they have transformed into wolves, crawling on all fours, growling, demanding raw meat. Still others note conditions like hypertrichosis, a genetic disorder causing excessive hair growth, which led superstitious villagers to see wolf children paraded in courts and fairs as living proof of the myth. These explanations strip away the supernatural, but they do not dissolve the fear. They remind us that the beast can live in blood and bone, not just in story. But science alone cannot contain the werewolf. The myth's endurance lies not in biology, but in metaphor. The wolf has always symbolized the untamed, the wild hunger beyond walls and firelight. To become wolf is to surrender to instinct, to shed the burden of conscience. That is why the figure persists, not because we believe in literal transformation, but because we recognize the temptation. The werewolf is every uncontrolled outburst, every indulgence that crosses into ruin, every moment we feel our reason slipping. It is the rage that flares behind the eyes before words can stop it. It is the hunger that devours what love should protect. In literature and film, the werewolf's role shifted once again in the late 20th and 21st centuries. No longer only a monster to be slain, it became a creature to be pitied, even loved. Stories like The Howling, an American werewolf in London, Underworld, and Twilight recast the wolf not as damnation, but as identity. The beast became romantic, erotic, a force of loyalty and passion as much as violence. To master the wolf was to master oneself. To love the wolf was to embrace power and wildness without shame. In these retellings, The werewolf ceased to be merely victim or villain and became a hero, or at least an anti-hero. Yet even in these softened forms, the core remains. The wolf is always about duality. Whether tragic, demonic, or romantic, the werewolf embodies the tension between human and animal, society and wilderness, order and chaos. It is a myth that adapts because it speaks to something permanent. We are creatures of fire and word, but also of fang and claw. The wolf does not lurk outside us. It breathes beneath our ribs. Imagine it this way. A man stands beneath the full moon. He is educated, clothed, baptized, civilized. Yet as the silver light touches him, his hands tremble. Not because his bones are breaking, but because the ancient memory of the hunt still stirs in his blood. Civilization is only a few thousand years old. Instinct is millions. The werewolf is that reminder of the past, pressing through the present, the animal demanding its due. In Gothic tradition, the werewolf is kin to other dark doubles. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the vampire with its hunger for blood, even the ghost bound to its unfinished past. Each is a shadow self, proof that the true horror is not the stranger at the door, but the fracture in our own reflection. The wolf's howl, echoing through forests or across cinema screens, is our own voice when masks are torn away. And so the werewolf endures, because it is more than legend, it is confession. It is the acknowledgement that inside every civilized man or woman lies a wilderness waiting. We chain it with ritual, we silence it with law, we soothe it with prayer, but sometimes it slips through, in violence, in desire, in moments we cannot explain. That is why the myth does not die. It does not need to be believed in literally. It needs only to be felt. From Lycaon's blasphemous feast to Odin's wolf warriors, from witch trial pyres to the silver screens of Hollywood, the shape has shifted, but the meaning has not. The werewolf is hunger without restraint, power without control, self without boundary. It is the beast within, and it is always waiting. Perhaps that is why we still look to the moon. Its pale light has nothing to do with transformation in any biological sense. Yet it reminds us that cycles rule us of night and day, of hunger and satiety, of calm and fury. When the full moon rises, something in us remembers the old stories, and for a moment, the walls of the village feel thin, the forest presses closer, the breath grows quick, the wolf is near. The history of the werewolf, then, is not just about a monster that stalked our past. It is about the fragile wilderness inside every human heart, and the endless struggle to master it. Whether we picture it in the forests of Arcadia, the battlefields of the Vikings, the trials of medieval Europe, or the silvered glow of Hollywood, the truth is the same. The line between man and beast is thin, and it runs through us all. The beast of legend may be slain by silver, but the beast within cannot be killed, only acknowledged, endured, and, if we are fortunate, tamed.